Thank you, Alex. Rather, I would like to present some work that I've been doing with Alan Ruttenberg on the notion of history in the basic formal ontology. And the reason is that the current definition of history in the BFO is a little bit problematic. So this is how it reads. A history is a process that is the sum of the totality of processes taking place in the spatio-temporal region occupied by the material part of a material entity. And the example that is given is the life of an organism from the beginning to the end of its existence. So why is this a problem? Well, take an example for the military. So you can see here that in this information model that is designed by our Ministry of War, that a fair part of its basis lies in papers, which were actually papers that have been used for the development of the BFO. So as a consequence, if the military uses the BFO and the notion of history, then for them there is no problem to describe the architectural modifications that they did here on the buildings on the right as being part of the history of those buildings. But for the good old battlefields, there is a problem, because battlefields, they are sites, and sites are immaterial entities. So strictly speaking, they do not have a history which includes anything that happened on that site. And that is also the case for buildings like this. This is a house in Buffalo where in 1902, the first inauguration of President Theodore Roosevelt happened. Now that inauguration was not somewhere inside of a wooden beam or inside of a wall. It was in a room which is a site boundary dependent on the ceiling, the floor and the walls of that room. So we find also several examples in biomedicine for which it is a problem. Take a colonoscopy. Clearly, anybody who has ever had a colonoscopy will for sure remember it. And remembering a colonoscopy is part of the history of the patient for the simple reason that remembering happens in the material part of your brain. But at the other hand, the scope is not introduced in a material part. It's introduced in a site, the lumen of the colon. And also a lot of activities which are part of a colonoscopy are outside the spatio-temporal region occupied by the patient. So for that reason, if the BFO history does not allow colonoscopies to be part of the history of a patient. So the problem with BFO history in a nutshell is that not all processes a material entity participates in are parts of its history, though many actually should be. The history of other sorts of entities like sites are not considered to have histories. And the term history itself has no face value. So I would like to divide this presentation in 5 further parts. So first, make you aware of some distinctions between what we could call the BFO theory and the BFO renderings in different ontologies. Then look at the history of history in the BFO literature. Then look at the use of history in bioportal ontologies that have a class history in it. Some major points of critique, and then propose some solutions. So there are 2 distinct BFO ontologies, BFO owl and BFO fall. Both reflect the same perspective on reality denoted by the BFO theory, as described in specifications and several papers. Now, you may not assume that the theory is complete, and this for a variety of reasons. And also, only part of the theory is axiomatized, a large part, but not completely in first-order logic, and an even smaller part translated in BFO owl. History is an example of this. That only the material part of a material entity determines its history is not axiomatized. Now, further important is the difference that the owl rendering and the fall renderings are such that the former only uses binary relations. And this has as consequence that certain assertions that one would want to make can be expressed in first-order logic, but cannot be expressed in owl. And that has some consequences, as we'll still see in the history of history in the BFO. So one of the first places where we can find it is in a paper by Pierre Guenot and Barry Smith in 2007, where they wrote, we can define the life of a continuant as the aggregate of the occurrence in which it participates. Now, that definition was replaced by another one, which you can find in the Robert R. book. A history is a process that is the sum of the totality of processes taking place in the spatio-temporal region, occupied by a material entity or site, including processes on the surface of the entity or within the cavities to which it serves as host. Now, why this change? For a number of reasons. One was that participation is too vaguely elucidated, something which is still the case in the BFO. By that time, also the term process aggregate, which was used in an earlier version, was removed in a newer version of the BFO. And then there is, of course, the problem, if you anchor something into spatio-temporal regions, how would that work for specifically and generically dependent continuants? At the same time of that new definition, there was the note that the relation between a material entity and its history is one-to-one. Now, that was actually a dictate enforced because of the limitations of AL. So here you can see that there is a discussion list here. The link is at the bottom, which gives actually some reflections on what happened in the working group, that when the BFO was switched from 1.1 to 2.0, was tasked for making an OWL rendering of it. Parts of the discussions are acceptable, and you can also see a couple of issues that were raised. One of the issues was the need to have what they called history segments. Now, that was at the time that the lack of temporal indexing in OWL was identified as a problem, and that hacks were proposed to deal with it. An example was the idea of temporally qualified continuants, by means of which one would refer to a specific time-stamped phase or portion of a larger enduring object. So you can see on the left here how that would work for the different development phases that a human being undergoes, and on the right, there's an example of a disease. So where a specific disease over time can instantiate different subtypes of a specific disease type. But the drawback was that such entities are not something that is committed to in the BFO theory. Now, with history segments, one tried to do something similar with histories, thereby building on the fact that the occurrent parthood relationship is not time indexed. However, it seemed only possible to do so if there would be a one-to-one correspondence between a history and what it is a history of. History segments never made it into the BFO, but nevertheless, that one-to-one correspondence, for whatever reason, was actually maintained. Now, you could also ask yourself the question, now, would there be a one-to-one correspondence between a continuant in general and a history? Now, one-to-one correspondence has two sides. So if there is one continuant, would there be one history for that continuant? Well, that follows from the definition. Any spatio-temporal region in which processes take place can have only one sum of those processes. And if such spatio-temporal region is occupied by a continuant, only then is such sum a history. Now, the other part is not guaranteed. There is no BFO axioms that prevent the site and a material entity to spatially occupy the same spatial region. So therefore, two measures were taken to solve that problem. The first one was to restrict history even more to the material part of a material entity. And now secondly, to hard code, if we may say so, that one-to-one correspondence, because it doesn't follow automatically from the definitions or any of the axioms. So here you can see all the axioms that govern actually history in the BFO. For these ones, I just showed you the comment, but the one in which the one-to-one correspondence is hard-coded are here on the right. That is done by making the history of relationship functional on both the first and the second argument. So how is history used in other ontologies? Well, I took a look at the bioportal by the end of 2023. And at that time, there were 1,169 artifacts in it. Only 124 of them had history as a class inside it. 42 of those history classes are not BFO's history. 18 didn't define history at all. 18, if you would look at them through the glasses of the BFO, then their subclass for history would be a process, but not a history, a generically dependent continuant or an independent continuant. And 6 define it so as to conflate occurrence and continuance. Of those 124, 82 imported BFO's history, 80 from version 2.0 and 2 from BFO 2020. Only 10 of those 82 made subtypes of history, which makes us assume that they simply imported history because they imported the entire BFO, but actually don't need it. Of those 10 that defined subtypes, 9 did it in a way that is not compatible with the definition of the BFO. So here you have the list. It is not too difficult for each one of them to find one argument for why it is not compatible with the definition of history. I'm not going to go into the details here. You can find the answers in the paper. So what are my major points of critique? One is methodologically. I think it is absolutely not acceptable that the limitations of a representation language drive a decision to impose restrictions without providing further metaphysical arguments. There is, of course, a terminological issue. It doesn't seem right to use the term history when it means history of the material parts of a material entity. Content-wise, there is a problem of incomplete axiomatization. Now, that is everywhere a little bit in the BFO, but it is explicitly important here for history. Now, we could also take a rather charitable view on what happened there. So some say that history actually was a misnomer and that it was never meant to be that what was represented as a history would be candidate for a history of everything, and that it was only for those material parts of material entities. Well, if that is indeed the case, okay, then we can say, well, but BFO is now silent about whether other continuants can have histories too. And that gives us then an opportunity to define it in such a way that the current shortcomings in future versions are actually overcome. So what can we do about it? We can make some conservative corrections. A very simple one is change the label. Change history into history of the material part of a material entity or something similar. Axiomatize the existing definition completely. Okay, so I used a couple of times on the slides occupied by between quotes. That is because there is no formal relationship occupied by in the BFO, but there are different variants of it. And those variants together with a couple of other relations can indeed be used to axiomatize it completely. For instance, here a spatial-temporal region STR is occupied by a continuant C, if and only if, and then these 5 requirements here. The second part that we have to do is to deal with that issue, the sum of the totality of processes of. Now, that is also not too difficult. Okay, we can make an axiom that says every process that spatio-temporally occupies a spatial-temporal region, which is an occurrent part of the spatial-temporal region spatial-temporally occupied by a history H, is an occurrent part of H. Next, remove that hard-coded one-to-one correspondence. If it is only needed for owl, leave it to the owl people. Expand the definition of history. Okay, we can define, let's call it for the time being, history star is a process that is the sum of the totality of processes taking place in the spatial-temporal region occupied by an independent continuant. So generalize it a little bit. In that case, what we would call history of the material part of a material entity would then be a subtype of it. Of course, we need to replace material entity in the existing history axioms by independent continuant. And what do we win? Okay, first, although sites can overlap material entities, it is hardly conceivable that non-fired sites can have a history identical with the history of a material entity. It would actually mean that the site and then the material entity that completely fills the site start to exist at exactly the same time. Then during the entire time of the existence of one, the other exists, And for the material entity, it still completely fills that site, and then both go out of existence at exactly the same time. It is very hard to come up with a practical scenario of that, and I had to resort to Captain Picard and his Star Trek Enterprise to find some example that might work. But otherwise, I can't think of any. And like I said, one can leave it to BFO, OWL renderings to include a subtype of history whose instances indeed exhibit one-to-one correspondence. Now, better, I think, is to make some more substantive improvements. And some substantive improvements are local. Local in the sense that we only need to change further things about history, but we don't need to touch other parts of the BFO. So a more inclusive definition of history would be a history star is a process that is the sum of the totality of, in the first place, processes P1 taking place in the spatial-temporal region occupied by at least one independent continuant, and 2 processes P2, which are suitably related to processes P1. Now, suitably related might be a little bit vague here, but it can perfectly be axiomatized. But what is suitably related may vary depending on the circumstances. But there are certainly certain combinations which happen quite a bit and that therefore could be introduced. 2 examples. For instance, for P2 processes suitably related to P1, when they occur in sites that are continuant part of a material entity or in sites that are boundary dependent on a material entity. Or, second possibility, occurring in sites in which the independent continuant is located and that bring about some changes in parts of that independent continuant. So it's not too difficult to see that the colonoscopy, for instance, would qualify for both of those suitably related definitions. Now, an expansive improvement would require some changes either to the BFO or adopt an extension. And here is an extension that Alan and I have been working on over the past year and that we presented at Formal Ontology and Information Systems a couple of months ago. So we noticed that when you look very carefully at the definition of process and at all the axioms that govern the behavior of processes, that there are some really unintended results that have to change anyhow. But because the 2 of us, we are not custodians of the BFO itself, so we decided not to touch that, but introduce a new occurrent, which we call change, with several subtypes underneath it. So the definition of change is the following. A change is an occurrent that happens to at least one continuant that is not a spatial region and happens in a process P, such that in the course of P, some particular comes in or goes out of existence or exhibits a difference in some relation to an other entity, including differences in instantiation. So on the basis of that definition of change, we could introduce a minimally expansive history definition, which would read, the history plus is a process that is the sum of the totality of temporal parts of processes in which a change happens to some instance of continuant. What we win here, well, specifically and generically dependent continuants can then have history too without being bothered by those spatial or spatio-temporal considerations. We also defined different subtypes of change. A couple of them are relevant for the expose here. So one is that of a monosequential change. It is a change C, all whose occurrent parts that are changes stand in the temporal layer of relation to C. You can visualize that as this. Here we have the axiom for temporal layer. Here we have the axioms for monosequential change. Imagine that during some temporal region, I turn my head from left to right and back and forth. While I'm doing that, okay, there is a spatial change of my head, a spatial change of my nose, a spatial change of my left and right ear, a spatial change of my left and right earlobe. Okay? All those changes, they happen at exactly the same time. Well, according to those axioms here, the spatial change of my left earlobe is a temporal layer of a spatial change of my ear. And the spatial change of my ear is a temporal layer of a spatial change of my head. And also spatial change of my nose is a temporal layer of the spatial change of my head. But the spatial change of any of my ears is not a temporal layer of the spatial change of my nose. Both happen at exactly the same time under this scenario, but they are not temporal layers of each other. Some more definitions which are relevant. A simple change is a monosequential change that happens to precisely one continuant and has no change as proper occurrent part. And a change sequence would be a change whose proper temporal parts that are monosequential changes are temporally ordered. Special case of that would be a change profile where all those changes are actually simple changes that happen to the same continuant. So with this definition, we can then propose a maximally expansive history definition, which is a history plus star is a change sequence comprised of all changes that happen to or are suitably related to what happens to a continuant. What will be the major advantages of E1 star plus? Well, it is applicable to all sorts of continuants. And as you can see, when you study all the axioms together, there is an automatic preservation of the desired one-to-one correspondence. So an example would be the Nobel Committee when it decides on the nominees for instance, economy. At the moment of that decision, each nominee undergoes a change in that they acquire a role, nominee for the Nobel Prize. Now the decision and the role acquisition are suitably related and would constitute a change sequence, and therefore that would be part of the history of the nominees. Now, is there a disadvantage? I can think of one. Simply think about what sort of activity, with or without consent, typically must have happened for a woman to become pregnant some 2000 years ago. Now, according to the current history definition, activities of that sort are not part of the history of a woman, and that for the same reasons as a colonoscopy isn't. But with the inclusive definitions, they are. And that might not sit well in certain circles. So you might know that Barry, when he wrote his 16 Days paper, he was invited by a bishop or a cardinal who later became the Pope. Well, if the new definition would be accepted for history, then maybe Alan and I might risk to be invited not by the Pope, but by the Inquisition. So, conclusion and takeaway messages. The type history is in BFO 2020 too restrictively defined compared to what scholars closely involved in the development of the BFO have published about it over the past 25 years. Now, correcting it in future versions has barely impact on existing representational artifacts. That is because not many use it, and the few that do use it wrongly. So if they want to keep their claim that they are compatible with the BFO, they will have to change their subtypes of history anyhow. And now lastly, there are some easy fixes that at least bring some more clarity, but that have the disadvantage that it keeps all the restrictions, while a comprehensive solution requires other parts of the BFO to be expanded as well.
Vocabulary.